Passenger and all cargo operations have noticeable disparities in their risks as well as protections. There is no better person to have on stage to moderate this very important discussion and to seek answers than Captain Rich Hughey. Rich is the chair for ALPA's President's Committee on Cargo, and he is also a fellow Federal Express pilot, or as we call it now, FedEx pilot, and he's also a friend. Rich, take it away.
Thank you, Captain Harrison. Welcome, everyone. The purpose of this panel is to continue the discussion of risk and protections in commercial aviation with a focus on cargo operations. Since cargo only makes up 7% of the Part 121 pie, I felt that for the audience that it would be helpful to compare and contrast cargo and passenger operations. Many of you already know the disparity in accident rates between passenger and cargo because that was discussed on a forum just like this in 2015's ALPA Air Safety Forum. This year, we want to better understand why and is how we do safety and security keeping up with the demand signal of risk. Before we dive into that, though, it's worth noting that we are trending well. We have set the bar for excellence in the transportation industry. The passenger side is now 8 years without a fatal accident. That is outstanding. As ALPA President Captain Tim Knoll often quotes and reminds us that all pilots are cargo pilots, since freight moves on the bellies of passenger carriers as well. So what's different? For one thing, the business models. Moving people and moving freight have different operational requirements. Passengers come with their own set of risks. And as every cargo pilot jokes, passengers are self-loading cargo. Not so much with freight. That was your cue to laugh. All right. Cargo operations tend to be a hub and spoke system with long sit times. While freight is offloaded, sorted, and then uploaded, passenger operations tend to be point-to-point with minimal sit times. Cargo pilots fly about 60% at night. Passenger pilots fly about 10% at night. So these operational differences have associated risks. The passengers have no fly lists and lithium battery PEDs to deal with. Cargo operations, the freight is wide and varied to include lithium batteries and lots of other dangerous goods. These are different risks for sure. We also have animals, aircraft engine, MRAPs. Every special cargo load is a science experiment because it's non-standard each time. Is there a higher risk for exposure for pilots who fly mostly at night? Does that hub and spoke system creates long sit time, in turn creates longer duty times, but less block time for pilots? So passenger pilots average about 50 block hours per month. Cargo pilots average about 30. Some question this difference in proficiency should be factored into deciding training cycles. Because of the higher percentage of night operations, some cargo flights operate into airports very early and leave very late with no one in the tower and only center sectors to provide approach control. Security on cargo ramps does not look like a passenger terminal. Many cargo aircraft do not have hardened doors. Some question whether that's accounted for with that loss of an important barrier and if the reactionary gap is a factor to be considered. Are these simply just operational differences, or is one type of operation dialed higher on the risk scale than others? And are we dialed into how different risks overlap and accumulate to contribute to an overall risk profile? What about protections? Do these two types of operations have similar levels of protections? Here are some examples. Passenger pilots have fatigue protection via science-based work rest rules called Part 117. What protections exist for undeclared dangerous goods and the hazard along with special cargo? And that's relevant for both passenger and cargo operations. Over the last 2 years, lithium battery transport by air has been funneled to cargo operators. How are cargo ramps, access to flight decks, with and without hardened doors, protected comparatively to passenger aircraft? RF capability, based on the frequencies of the largest passenger aircraft into that airport. Sometimes it's a regional jet with 50 people, but it isn't matched for the 2 wide-body cargo aircraft that go into that same airport. MD-11s and 747s. cargo aircraft with greater than 2 engines. No ETOPS requirements for them. Is there more to consider than just raising the protection floor to mitigate risk? Can it keep up with the demand signal of risk? Some recent changes and new ideas in our industry. The FAA compliance philosophy. A big change still ongoing. We now have access to much more data thanks to sources like ASAP and FOQA. We're getting smarter at understanding and assessing our risk with that data. And then there are new methods like SMS and other safety strategies being developed and implemented that aren't reliant on always looking at the past, but designed to identify trends and forecasts for better resiliency in the operation going forward. Our trend is good, but we don't want to wait for the next accident. I don't want that data. All right, that's our setup. So, our distinguished guests to my left, Ms. Victoria Newhouse from the TSA will discuss security. Dr. Pete Demitry from 4D Enterprises Human Performance. Ms. Janet McLaughlin from the FAA will discuss hazardous material. And Ms. Bobbi Wells from FedEx Express will discuss safety at the operator's level. And then we'll close with our own Captain Steve Jangelis from the Airline Pilots Association. Ms. Newhouse, you have the floor.
Thanks, Rich. Appreciate it. And on behalf of TSA, our acting administrator, Dr. Hughey, and the whole TSA team, to reiterate what my colleague Darby LaJoy said earlier, we can't do this without you. You are a critical part of our partnership with industry. It's not just the operator, it's the folks who are actually operating in the transportation systems, whether it's aviation or surface transportation. All of you are the first line as we think of our officers screening passengers at airports, or our inspectors inspecting cargo warehouses, or our front lines. You are also serving as our front lines for global aviation security. I think as Secretary Kelly has recently said, the threats to aviation are very attractive, continue to be attractive. Rich, you talked about some of the differences between cargo and passenger risk mitigation, risk assessment. It's not lost on TSA that not only have passenger aircraft been an attractive target along with airports for attacks by groups such as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other terrorist organizations, but don't forget about the 2010 cargo plots. Al-Qaeda successfully tried to attack 2 U.S. flagged full-all cargo aircraft for the cost of $4,200. Minimal cost imposed and inflicted incredible economic and really psychological damage on our industry in terms of what we need to do to stick together to mitigate. So that's not lost on our leadership. And speaking of our leadership, today is a very good day for TSA. Admiral David Pekoski, TSA's nominee for our new administrator, was just voted out of committee in the Senate. So his nomination is headed to the Senate floor for a confirmation vote very soon. So we're looking forward to introducing Admiral Pekoski to all of you and all of the great work that we've done in partnership with ALPA. Earlier in the week, some of my colleagues talked about known crew member. It's been really one of the flagship partnerships in terms of assessing risk and using risk to look at how we can expedite our flight crews through airports. You are our trusted partners. I can't tell you, there are probably 6 different ways each one of you is vetted on a continuous basis, both for terrorist ties, for criminal ties. You obviously work on the safety side as well for your FAA certificates. So we have a great deal of trust in you, and I think that is reflected in our partnerships, not only for known crew member. Federal Flight Deck Officer Program is another flagship risk-based program where we're actually asking all of you to step up to serve, and you do it on your own time, your own dime, and really out of service to your country. So for that, we thank you as well. I think for TSA, obviously security is our middle name. We will never abdicate that responsibility. And as you can see in this current environment from a security standpoint, the challenges grow, both domestically and internationally. It's not just the terrorists over there that are trying to do bad things here or on inbound aircraft. We have to now worry about, we think about quite a bit and work on, insider threat has been a big area of concern. Pat Gannon and Darby talked about active shooter, some of the risks that are imposed, and some of the, I will say, false alarms as well that Darby mentioned. How do we handle that as a community? Our first questions are always, When we have an incident that happens, such as Fort Lauderdale, our leadership's first question is, assessing who is involved, meaning has anybody been harmed? Whether it's our officers, whether it's the flight crews, whether it's actually the passengers. We look at the entire system. Those are the first three things I know out of my mouth, Captain Mansheim's mouth, and all of our leadership's heads is how are we making our folks safe? Number one, first and foremost. But also looking at how we can be resilient, and we're not going to just fold to these types of threats, but we actually work together to do that. You talked a little bit, Rich, too, about some of the differences between some of the security requirements. I know we're in an open forum, so I'm not going to get into a lot of specifics, but on the full all-cargo side, we're actually working very closely with our partners within the Department of Homeland Security and FAA on several programs, one of which is the Air Cargo Advanced Screening Program, where we can actually do preloaded cargo targeting, meaning we can actually look at the shipments before they're loaded and actually put on board aircraft, particularly for the full all-cargo environment. That's an important tool. We've been working very closely with our partners at FedEx, UPS, and DHL and other carriers since the 2010 attempt on the cargo airliners to look at different ways we can identify highly suspicious cargo for, at least from our perspective, from a security perspective. Obviously, Customs and Border Protection was looking at that along with other concerns in terms of other types of threats to our nation's security and to that aircraft. It's an American flag on the tail. It's not lost on us. So that's really a big part of what's driving us toward the ACAS system. We're looking at putting out some rulemaking. We have about 21 air carriers that are participating in the Air Cargo Advanced Screening pilot program that's been going on for a few years. And we're looking to put that into our daily practice, put that in our regulatory portfolio. In my office, under the leadership of Captain Mansheim, that's our responsibility. We look at all the regulatory areas for security, working with our airlines, our operators, and all of you to look at what makes sense. We actually want to make sure we put in the right safeguards, whether they're regulatory or best practices or other things that we can do together. You already have a very high bar for things such as training and safety. What we're trying to do is model that. Paul Lai from our Office of Compliance earlier this week looked at and came in to explain what we're doing in terms of our compliance philosophy. We've looked at what FAA has been doing over the last several years to see how we can actually have more of an outcome focus on our compliance regime. It's not just hit them with a ticket. That doesn't make security any better for any of us. What we want to do is find ways to work with our operators, our airports, our crews, and our passengers to make things better and more secure. So looking at the model that FAA is actually seeing higher safety compliance and less penalties imposed by using that and actually self-reporting. That's another area that's very important to security. All of you, like I said, are our eyes and ears on the ground. And with respect to our efforts to advise the administrator, ALPA has a big voice with our Aviation Security Advisory Committee. Captain Demitry is graciously offered to serve as ALPA's representative and works on numerous issues, including international and insider threat issues, on behalf of your interests. So that's another body that I think Admiral Bukowski will find incredibly useful, will actually lean on you, and your collective voice is represented on that committee. I'm fortunate enough to be the executive sponsor, so I actually have really have a lot of respect for everybody who comes and serves on their own time, again, their own dime. There's we can't even buy them lunch unless we put out the hat for the lunch, because we're the government. We don't have, that's not the good use of the taxpayers' dollars, but all of these people come on their own time. That shows a great deal of commitment on ALPA's part to continue to partner with us. And Captain Knoll and Captain Demitry have been great about coming to us when we have new measures, such as the electronics bans you've been hearing about, the new measures that we've implemented to raise global aviation security. We have actually made provisions. We recognize that, as Rich has, he's got his iPad here. I'm a little jealous. I wish I had brought mine. But people don't think of, well, you're going to ban electronics. Well, what about flight bags, electronic flight kits, all of those things? We've made appropriate provisions in those security measures to recognize those requirements as well, based on the voices that we're hearing from all of you. So I'll just stop there in a nutshell. Just like to thank everybody for the continued partnership, and I look forward to answering some of your questions at the end.
Thank you, Victoria. Appreciate that. I look forward to hearing more about the TSA's compliance philosophy. We'll now move over to Dr. Demitry, and Pete, you have the floor.
So good afternoon, everybody. We're going to take a little orthogonal kind of change in direction. In some of the early presentation that Rich was talking about, he talked about the science of daytime flying. What I'm going to do is we're going to talk about, how does one really take a look at science? How does one really kind of assess evidence? Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Just so you can determine what my conflicts are, determine if you want to believe anything that I'm going to tell you in the next few minutes. In the medical community, that becomes now a really, really big deal. So, when you assess science, the evidence for science, it doesn't matter if we're doing it for the science of human factors, the science of physiology, flight time, duty time, fatigue, or just anything in the press for for medicine. So all evidence-based anything is an approach that embraces all the information that's out there. It creates a priority of some information is better than other information. We're looking for that hierarchy of what's going on, and not all information is the same. I have a friend that thinks that, hey, this is a good idea. So that's some evidence. He's been in that environment. It's an anecdotal N of one, okay? From that hypothesis, then you get what we call in the medical profession the longest white lab coat. Okay, so he's been around the longest. Transition is that becomes the guy with the most stripes in the cockpit, and all of a sudden he's the expert. And he's an expert for a right reason. He's a crusty old fighter pilot where I've come from, and there's a reason why he's old and crusty. And then you have the limited laboratory experience that's based on more randomized kinds of stuff, a more controlled environment. And then you have the combination of experience of what has the industry seen over the last 40 years. And ultimately, when you put all that together and you have all the data showing that the laboratory agrees with the physiological data and agrees with the real world experience, now you're starting to approach something that is starting to make sense. So everybody who knows me knows that, I was a fighter pilot before I was a doctor, and somehow medical school couldn't take the fighter pilot out of me. So we're going to talk a little bit of truth to power. And here's what I know about fatigue, having studied it as a test pilot physician in the Air Force and looking at it for a long time. So how did we assess when we were sending B-2 crews over, for 60-hour missions? And fatigue was a big issue. I was part of the 117 discussions several years ago, but I keep it real simple because I went to a lot of public schools and I'm a fighter pilot, okay? So when I know someone's tired, I look at the 4 C's: calculations, complacencies, communication, and cognition. Those things, you can take it all the way back to the Spirit of St. Louis with Charles Lindbergh. When you talk about and you see his diary, on the very, very first flight, transatlantic, these things were already in play. Now, we're getting a whole lot better at measuring fatigue, to be sure, and we've spent decades doing it. You've got national research centers looking at it. You've got all the airlines and labor, everybody, and the regulators are all working together to try to get a handle on it. So we've gotten better on it. We've got the actigraphy, you've got the surveys, you've got the modeling, and the subjective logs. We even have the comparison, which I thought was brilliant, that compares 16, 17 hours of flight of duty time to being able to blow a 0.1 in your blood alcohol concentration. And we're very, very close to getting the right biomarkers, physiological biomarkers, that will really show an objective, reproducible, quantitative. And the military and operational people in industries of all kinds, not just aviation, but railroad, everybody that has continuous 24-hour ops are really looking forward to those kinds of things to really kind of do that final assessment of a quantitative ability to measure fatigue. But there's another dirty little secret. I can measure fatigue, but that doesn't tell me the whole story. So what's the evidence? Well, here's what we don't know. Every year I get a little older, and every year what I could do 5 years ago is a little different. It's a little different how I sleep. It's a little different, and all the older gentlemen in the room know exactly what I'm talking about. And as a physician, we can kind of have that kind of honest conversation. But the whole operation of operating through the WACL You know, there's not a whole lot of science that's really been studied through that. A lot of it has been done in sleep laboratories and things like that. But if you're sleeping at the Marriott or the Hilton or stuff like that at some of the in the RONs, that all becomes very, very different. The crew resilience. So how does a 30-year-old crew work, you know, compared to a 40-year-old? And again, you can read the list. I'm not going to read the list to you, but those are all things that absolutely, okay, have not really been adequately studied and stratified to figure out what is okay in one set of conditions, all of a sudden will push a crew over depending on the fatigue level, going back to the cognitive effort, the communication, the calculation skills that we covered earlier. So the fatigue, here's the evidence. What does it all mean? The science does not currently provide a whole lot of guidance for this back of the clock flying, which the cargo community does so much of. So there are many scientific gaps, and what I really want to do is that the basic sciences are not going to fill in those gaps. So there are other difficulties. I can try to study it in the laboratory, and the way we do that, of course, is we go get some hungry, starving grad students, and they will do anything for food and money, and probably other things these days. And we will tease them, and we will get all the kind of data that we want. The question, though, is that's really, really different than what we find out in the industry of what's going on. And yet those papers are not unimportant, but they only inform partially. Then the other way, of course, doing it is to actually go do it out in the field, and that becomes very, very difficult because there's so many more confounders you can't control. You know, one day the weather is cab okay, the other time it's 300 and a quarter, and blowing winds, and how can you get even 5 data points that, you know, becomes anything more than 100 anecdotal N of ones. Very, very hard for, you know, any kind of statistician, commonly known to me as statistician, kind of do any kind of statistics with that. So on the one side, it's not generalizable. On the other side, it's not relevant. And yet together, you have to do that meta-analysis to try to do, you know, the wisest thing in order to inform what to do. So I am a fighter pilot. That means that I'm not interested in just talking about a problem. I'm going to do something. I'm going to blow something up, or I'm going to do something. So recognize that the truth is always the truth. Okay, the truth is always the truth. That's kind of straightforward. The other philosophy that we have is in God we trust. Everybody else needs to bring some data. Okay, I find myself that as I get older, I find myself increasingly more open to any kind of concept, but I'm vested in nothing. Go back to this bullet above there. In God I trust, bring data. And doubt data when it doesn't agree with what your real world experiences are. Okay, that means it's weighted heavily to the laboratory and it doesn't have that external generalization. It may not be totally relevant. And ultimately, the last couple there, use the decades of industry experience to really do a lot of the informed guidance. And I will tell you, as a test pilot physician from the Air Force, I have to tell you, one of the things that I have never felt that we do well as aviators is we don't go to school, and I'm going to stir the pot here because I get to leave town quickly after this. We really don't go to school on the near misses. Okay, the problem, it's not a problem. Let me eat those words back. Whenever you have a very, very rare event, okay, like an incident, then it makes the statistics and everybody really real. How do you document the non-occurring event? Okay, that's been a problem since the time I was a baby aviator in the 70s. But the truth is there's a boatload of near misses. And if those were investigated with the same zeal, okay, that a bucket of blood is investigated, then there would be a whole lot more learned. And the goal, of course, is to avoid the bucket of blood. And I've always, thanks. I've always wanted to be somewhere where I could say that and someone was forced to listen to me. Thank you very much. So learn from the near misses. And again, FRMS seems to me as a very, very rational way to get all the stakeholders together okay, and take the little bit from the laboratory, a little bit from the experience, a little bit of the compromise, a little bit of the making sausage in order to come out with the most rational way to go forward. So with that, thank you very much.
All right, next up is Ms. Janet McLaughlin from the FAA. Janet, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here this afternoon. What would an ALPA meeting be without Janet here to tell you bad news about lithium batteries, right? Been doing this so long now, that's as soon as anyone sees me, we have to talk about lithium batteries. So, and normally I'm telling you I haven't solved the problem, so we keep talking about it. But one of the things that I want to talk about today is what's changed and what's different about the news today and what we're doing today and the approach we're taking than the last time I was here. So one of the things, of course, batteries are batteries. We know a lot about them now. We know a lot about their risk. We've never been able to really solve the problem in total, but I think one of the things that has changed today is everybody is now taking a responsibility in their part of trying to put a system together that possibly in the future we all can rely on much more than we do today. So what do I mean by that? So I think a lot of you have probably seen a lot of presentations from UL. They're talking about this third-party oversight system for the manufacturers. We think there's a great deal of promise in that, where they will look at the quality of the manufacturing process and have some type of a certification process that possibly the airlines or others can rely on and look at and say, okay, I should have confidence that these batteries were at least tested and at least the design was looked at and their processes. So that's one part. But I think even more importantly, ICAO, the international piece of civil aviation, and the FAA, excuse me, all the lines of business in FAA, there's something going on there now that really wasn't happening before to the degree it is now. And that is that everyone has recognized that there is a part of the safety risk of transporting batteries that involves the airplane. There's a part that involves the packaging. There's a part that involves the equipment the aircraft's using. There's a part that involves the quality of the batteries they're transporting, the number that they're transporting, how long they're going to have them on the airplane. And this sort of systems, I call it a systems look, because I think that's exactly what it is. We've been working very closely with our airworthiness and operations counterparts on trying to find different solutions to the risk that's presented from lithium batteries. We've had a great deal of discussion with Boeing and Airbus and the systems that are installed on aircraft, and how do we utilize the current aircraft today and get the best safety result were there to be an unintended incident or a fire or unintended event on the aircraft. So one of the things Boeing and Airbus have become very active in, along with the regulators and the battery manufacturers, is looking at how do you take a sort of a layered approach. So is there that one silver bullet resolution to this problem? No, there really isn't. We tried looking for that for several years, and unfortunately, the regulations themselves don't have a lot of flexible tools in them. So the proposal to ban them or take them off of one type of aircraft, put them on another, those were really the tools the regulations had to use. And everyone realizes that's not really where we want to go eventually. The airlines want to transport them. They want to transport them safely. The battery industry wants their product moved, and a lot of us want their product moved because we use those devices. The medical community uses the devices. We all want that technology to move forward. So one of the things that we started looking at was the capabilities of the aircraft and what those limitations are, and how do we get from the battery to the aircraft and somehow in between apply enough mitigation that the functions that the aircraft are designed to perform can perform, and that way the outcome is safe and the outcome isn't any different than it would be with any other product. So there's a lot of work being done in this area today, a lot being done by ICAO. There's a lot being done domestically, and that includes looking at packaging standards that have never been used in the lithium battery transport before. Testing the batteries to failure. So if you test the batteries to failure and see what happens if this unintended event, and whether it's high or low probability, what's going to happen if it does occur. And if you can keep that event inside the package, then that mitigation strategy, that prevents any of the systems of the aircraft from having to be capable of mitigating those fires. So that's one thing we're looking at with SAE. There's the SAE G27. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that work. It's taken a very long time, but this is a very complicated topic. But that's one of the things that everyone is starting to look at, is instead of looking at it as if we think the majority of batteries are safe, which is what everyone does believe, we're looking at it from the other perspective of, okay, but what happens if it does fail? And we're forcing it to fail and looking at what risk that produces. So that's a different lens to look at this safety concern than we've had in the past. And in addition to that, a lot of the operators have taken on a lot of initiatives and a lot of cost in trying to find ways to provide mitigation on the aircraft. And so if you start to look at it from that layered approach, and you look at it from the perspective of you put it in a package that has been demonstrated to withstand an unintended event and the battery failing, you put it in additional aircraft equipment that is shown to mitigate fires and heat events that are unattended, and then you have the systems that were built into the aircraft itself originally, you start to get a strategy, and you start to look at it as a safety system to transport the batteries. So I think that's a different approach than we've ever had before. It's always been, well, what's that one solution? You know, take them off, put them on, you know, limit the number. But that's never worked because of the, it's such a wide spectrum of chemistry, sizes, manufacturers, and so on. That has never been something that we've been able to determine how to manage. But this approach, I think, when it matures and we get through all of these processes and the operators continue to have a very high interest in this and continue to be investing in the safety equipment without it being in the regulations, which, as you all know, regulatory changes are pretty tough right now. So it's it's a different environment, it's a different process, and I think it is one that we have finally found a way that we may be able to have that systematic approach at some point in the not too distant future, where we can control the risk of lithium battery transport. So I think it's a little different message than we've had in the past. Have we completely eliminated the risk? No. We haven't changed the fact that lithium batteries present a risk, but what we are trying to move forward with is a way that there's enough layers of mitigation. There's no single point of failure again, and that's been the difficulty with lithium batteries, is because there weren't systems that could control the event, there was basically a single point of failure if they did catch on fire. So we're really, we're working very closely with all of our international counterparts. We're working with SAE, with UL, and all of the other relevant organizations. So I think it is a different message. I think it's something that we see as having possibly an ultimate result where we can say we think we have a system now. We think we have a way to determine that you can carry these. And we know what will happen if the unintended event occurs. And we think that whether it's packaging, operator equipment, and the aircraft, all these things together will be able to mitigate the event. So I think that's a little different message than we've brought before, so I wanted to make sure we shared that with you. If you're interested in any of these efforts, they're all public, so email me or let me know. I can always provide you information. The other thing that goes along with lithium battery concerns is always undeclareds and hazmat and dangerous goods. Of course, some of you have been in this business long enough to remember value jet, and of course we have a high concern about a lot of the dangerous goods that are picked up in particular outside of the United States and transported in. We're trying to look at the undeclared risk and the undeclared concern from a little different perspective now. So one of the things we do is every incident, every time an operator reports information to us, we action it 100% of the time. In the last 5 years, we have collected, I think, almost $14 million in fines for undeclared hazmat. The trouble is we don't know until it's already there and until somebody finds it and until somebody reports it. So there isn't any way for us to get to that root of the risk. We're reacting to it all of the time. So one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to partner with a lot of the operators to try and message to the people that have that high likelihood and probability that they may be shipping undeclareds. Because if you just look for them randomly and visit shippers, our statistical data says that doesn't get you much. And our data also shows that very few people do this on purpose. Almost all of them just don't know. Nobody has any, not nobody, but very few have any intent on trying to cause an event on your aircraft. They just do not know. So we're trying to find ways to get to that preventive side so we don't have the undeclareds to react to. Even actioning all of them, we still have a very high number every year. And so one of the things we want to do is try to get to that source. We also have more voluntary reporting methods now for the operators. So we're hoping a lot of these programs that we're working with now will help with trying to get to the root cause of a lot of the undeclared problem that it's hard to say we've been successful or not. We've issued a lot of civil penalties, but since you don't have that starting number, if you knew about them, then they wouldn't be undeclared, so you really don't know what that denominator is, and so it makes it a little difficult to determine how successful you really are in this area. But we've done a lot of work with some of our counterparts in China and some of the other countries where some of the cargo generally is picked up. So we've tried to develop in our relationships with them some ways of making sure that they know anything that we know. So we're sharing all that information, and I am very, very hopeful that in the future we can find a better way to partner in this aviation world and community and find a way to improve in this area. So if anyone's interested in or has any information for us, please don't hesitate to give it to us. I want to emphasize that we understand these are two of your greatest concerns when it comes to dangerous goods, and we continue to focus on these and and concentrate on trying to find better ways, trying to lower the risk, trying to lower the probability every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Appreciate that. Just want to remind my friends who fly passengers that this is our problem, undeclared dangerous goods. So it's important to solve that. Next up is Miss Bobbi Wells from FedEx Express. Bobbi, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rich, and thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. Albert Einstein said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." We're on an opportunity in aviation where we're standing before a huge chance to move forward. What's different for us is going to be the approach that we decide to take. We have to be willing to do things differently, think differently, use other mechanisms that we might not be comfortable with in order to achieve what that difference looks like. My slides should be coming up here soon, so I'm just going to keep moving. 3 things.
There you go.
Trust is essential. Risk and safety are not the same thing. And we're all, in aviation, part of a larger system. We have to recognize and understand what that system looks like in order to move the needle. For us to have trust, we have to be able to understand a little bit about one another. I grew up in a tiny little town in Wyoming. It's at the foothills of the Rockies, south of Jackson Hole. It's called Pinedale, Wyoming. You can Google it. About 1,500 people. It's a very outdoorsy community. That means I grew up skiing because my dad skied and he was born and raised there. So he was a very outdoors person. He was an extraordinary skier. He water skied, beautiful to watch on the water. He was also really amazing when it came to snow skiing. Every weekend, because my dad was on ski patrol, which means he was teaching lessons or making sure that people weren't hurting themselves or picking them up when they did, he would take us to this ski hill. And he taught us all to ski. 4 kids in my family. My brother's the youngest. My brother has a lot of skills around skiing. Me, not so much. So every weekend, we skied up in the mountains. And when I was a teenager, my dad came to me one time and said, "You know, Bobbi, you could be really good at skiing if you were willing to do just this and this and this. Relax, push yourself, try a little harder, be willing to let go." And I said to him, "You know, Dad, I'm good with my skiing skills. I'm fine. I can negotiate the hill, I can get down it all right, I can ski with my friends, I'm fine." And he said, "Don't you want to be better?" And I said, "You know, Dad, what I really don't want to do is I don't want to fall down. Because falling down sucks." It's hard to get up. You've got these long sticks attached to your feet. Sometimes you're in a lot of snow. It's hard to get your feet underneath you. It's hard. And he said, "You know, Bobbi, if you're not falling down, you're not learning." As individuals, we have to be willing to learn. As organizations, we have to be willing to learn. Learning means we have to be willing to be different. And sometimes it's not fun. Sometimes it's painful. It's not called growing fun, it's called growing pains. We have to be willing to take approaches that are different than what we've done in the past. And our ability to do that as individuals and as organizations determine our success and our relevance in the future. After I graduated from college, I joined the Army. I don't come from a military family, so it was a very foreign environment to me in many ways. My first duty station was in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and my first company commander was the epitome of an Army officer. He looked like an Army officer, he carried himself that way, and you could tell all he ever wanted to be was to be an officer in the Army. I was talking to him one time what it felt like to walk across the quad in front of our building, and all the soldiers that would walk by me would salute me. These were soldiers that didn't belong to me, they didn't know me, and I thought that was really odd. It felt odd. I mean, I knew the reason they did it. And he said to me, "Of course, they're saluting you because of the rank on your collar that you've earned, because of the training and the work that you've done." He said, "But with that acknowledgement, with that privilege, comes an obligation. Leaders don't walk by mistakes. Because if you walk by a mistake, you endorse it. Every single one of us has an obligation to not only recognize problems, but to do something about them. And doing something about them isn't just pointing them out to somebody and placing blame and telling them they need to go fix it. It means we need to take action to fix it as well." Our ability to do that in the future in aviation is going to determine, to a great extent, our success. Because if we walk by that mistake, it's as though we created it ourselves, and we can't allow that to happen. Harvard Business Review published an article about a year ago, talked about how high-performing companies typically had very effective systems within their functional areas. So within aviation, that would be technical operations would be functionally very effective within their division. Flight operations would be very effective within their division. They have the same lead, they have a shared lead or shared vision, they have the same kind of background in education, they share the same language. But the article went on to say that organizations that can connect really well will be the companies that will really be the high-performing companies. And within my organization, the way we're thinking of that and the way we're partnering with our ALPA leaders and our ALPA organization is that we have to take advantage of where we touch. Within my group, we're calling that managing and leveraging the energy at the seams of the organization. That's how we're going to be able to make a difference. Now, what that means is that quite often, we have a difference of opinion about how to proceed or what the solution is. That's okay, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that makes us more powerful. We have to be able to talk to one another. We have to be willing to share these ideas so that we can reach our mutual goal of improving aviation safety. Because we have a shared goal here. This is not a zero-sum discussion. Nobody wins and loses in this conversation. We all win if we can get better together. Is this safe?
Mm-hmm.
Is this safe?
Yep.
How about this?
What are you guys laughing at?
There's a difference of opinion around the room about which one of these things are safe. And what I know is that if we're going to have a conversation about safety, we're going to have a hard time agreeing. Because we all have different backgrounds. You have a different training background than I do. You have different experiences than I do. And whenever we talk about safety, it's easy for it to become an emotional discussion, which means it's hard really to talk about it objectively and to move the conversation forward. I have two boys, and when they were teenagers, and they would head off to school in the morning, and they both had trucks, I'd say to them, "Drive safe today." And they'd roll their eyes, as teenage boys quite often do with their moms, and they'd say, "When have I ever not been safe, Mom?" Now, I was smart enough not to list the times they'd had accidents or exceptions or other problems where their errors in judgment led to a problem. And I would sort of shrug and sigh and say a little prayer and hope they'd make it there okay. If I'd been smart, what I would have done is I would have talked about the risks they would encounter on their way to school. I would have talked about the grade school area that they'd be driving through and remind them to be careful at crosswalks, to watch for the crossing guard. If an emergency vehicle was parked alongside of the road, to watch out for it and yield to, give them a lot of room, slow down. That would have been a conversation where they would have recognized and been able to acknowledge actions that they could take, which means they would have been looking at the risk in their path and doing something about it. 100% of the time, human beings are hardwired to recognize risk and do something about it. Now, what you and I might do about it are different. And that's okay. But if we recognize that risk that's evident to us, then that puts us in a position where we can then start talking about an objective way to address it. We're all part of a system. You've heard systems talking up here. There's a number of people have mentioned systems. We're all part of a larger system. We're partnering with MIT, a professor from MIT, who is basing her actions or what she's training on around systems theory. And I asked her the first time I had a conversation with her, I asked her, so explain to me where human error fits in system theory. What's the number one reason for aviation accidents? It's pilot error. If you look at the history, the most recent history around accidents, but the problem with it is human beings are part of aviation. So if we just simply point at pilot error and hope that we correct that problem with that pilot or those pilots, that it'll go away, there's a problem in that. And people make mistakes. I don't know about you guys, but I make mistakes nearly every day, probably every day if you ask my boys. So the issue is we have to get beyond that discussion. And she said to me, when I asked her about human error, she said, if you understand the context in which behavior takes place, if you understand the system surrounding that person, and you understand it really well and robustly, to a high degree of predictability, you can determine how that person's going to react. So it's not the fault of people. Most of the time, in fact, probably 99% of the time, people don't come to work thinking, what can I screw up today so that I can get fired? Stuff happens, people make mistakes, and our processes and our systems have to be robust enough to protect who we are in aviation so that we can all be mutually successful. Because if there's a blip or a problem in aviation, it affects all of us. And it's something that we're all going to suffer from. So we have to get beyond talking about human error, because we're not going to engineer the humans out of aviation. You've heard a number of people mention resilience. Resilience is a very important element in an individual and a system to be able to react to negative events. It's not just, can I absorb the effect of that event, but it's how quickly can I recover afterwards. And there's work being done in the area of resilience engineering or resilience theory to help shore up or increase the effectiveness of responding to adversity. This is important work, and this is difficult stuff because this gets at human beings and how we think, how we react. A big piece of that has to do with, you've heard some discussions around human performance. How we get people to pay attention is incredibly important. When a crew is in a cockpit and there's some negative action happening, if there's some emergency, the natural reaction of human beings is that you narrow your vision in. That's where the term tunnel vision comes from. And we're hardwired to respond that way because that's what has helped our species to be able to identify the problem, the danger in our path, and focus our efforts around that so we could react to it. Well, the problem with it is, in the cockpit or in any environment that has a larger number of activities going around it, is when you narrow that focus, you might miss something going on around you that you need to be able to pay attention to. Teaching people how to actively pay attention and to do that intentionally on a regular basis allows you to recognize when you're in that situation where it might be an emergency or you might have had some startle event, so that you open your vision back up and you take note of those other things that are going on in your environment so you can react positively. You could take advantage of the tools still available to you. That focus on being less mindless about how we proceed. 40% of the time, we're on autopilot. We're acting out of habit. And we do that because it allows our brains to rest. But if we are intentionally paying attention, it doesn't tax our brains. Those are the times when you're most involved and you're paying attention to the signals going on around you. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area as well. And I think there's some key elements that we can teach people that will help lead us forward. We are where we are in aviation because of the work that has come before us, the people who have passed before us. We're in the safest transportation industry in the world. And none of us here would say that's good enough. But we got where we got to, we are where we are today because of stuff that has happened. And as you heard up here, that's not okay anymore. That's not sufficient. You don't drive your car by looking in your rearview mirrors. You have to be willing to look forward in front of you, because this has been very important. Being able to examine exceptions, incidents, or accidents when they happen is incredibly important. We still have to do that good, hard work. But we have to be willing to look out that front windshield. In that way, we can anticipate what's in our path and then react to it before it becomes a problem. Defensive driving, like they used to teach. So that's the way we want to operate our airlines. That's the way we want to proceed going forward. And we can't have this conversation about predictability and about anticipating events or potential issues if we can't have a productive and effective conversation with all the constituents, whether it's government, whether it's ALPA, whether it's company. Everybody has to participate in that conversation to be effective. And then we have to partner with academics who can help us design our systems in such a way that we take in data, look at it differently, look at it in the ways that other industries have looked at it, in order to tell us why it is that when these three things happen in sequence or in close proximity, it leads to a negative result. So, stuff that we could not figure out ourselves if we were just looking at what's going on in the system. The future is going to be different for us, but only if we get there together. Every single day we have to be willing to push into areas where we're uncomfortable. We have to be willing to grow, look for opportunities, ask for opinions that might be negative to ours or different than ours, and be willing to listen to one another so that we can reshape our future. And if we do this on a methodical basis, on a regular basis, our future will be wholly different. The Dakota tribe said, "We will forever be known by the tracks we leave behind us." These forums, this forum that you have annually, and the conversations that we have throughout the year are the ways that we leave footprints in the snow that will show what our future is going to look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobbi. That was very enlightening. Steve, it's all yours to close.
Thank you, Captain Rich, and to our fellow panelists, thank you very much for being here to attend our conference. To sum up what we've heard here today, there's a little bit of a discrepancy between passenger aircraft and cargo aircraft and their operations. The certificate that hangs on the wall of a freight airline is the same certificate, just change the name, as the same one that stands on the wall of a passenger airline, but yet there's many differences. We've listed them many times before, but as some of our subject matter experts that are up here on the stage today have spoken about, such as flight time, duty time, lithium battery shipments, fatigue issues, there's a number of discrepancies between the two operations. Understanding each other's views helps us recognize the differences. It also helps us characterize where we need to be better to move forward. And to Bobbi's comments, we don't look backwards, we look forward. Ms. Kathy Fox, the TSB chairperson of their investigative body in Canada, once said, "Your next accident is in your data right now." It's a true statement. We're getting data like we've never seen before. We would only look at that data after an accident. And through work of folks in this room, the rest of the industry and regulators, we've been able to open up that data through trust and agreements to start looking and mining that data and seeing where we're having those issues. Identifying risk is not safety. Managing risk, now that's safety. Working with mitigations, making sure that everyone is on the same page to run a safer operation. Taking it just a little bit further, sometimes our industry is really constrained by a reliance on cost-benefit methodologies. That determines sometimes the value of a regulation. Unfortunately, it sometimes, most of the time, includes the cost of a human life to the method as a determining factor for a regulatory decision. ALPA believes this is too narrow of a view for where we need to be right now. Let's talk about TCAS. Take this one for an example. TCAS, when it first happened, and when it first was implemented, was only on passenger airplanes. First people to get it were passenger airplanes. It took a passenger airplane hitting a cargo airplane to bring it to cargo aircraft. You think about that. Then the math added up. It's a great idea. Yeah, we should put it on all aircraft, all the way across the board. Let's talk about another episode, UPS 1354. If we're to use the same methodology, cost benefit, and the value of a human life, I take a look in this room. This is about the capacity of an A380. Everyone in this room, look around. These are your fellow passengers. Say a 747-8. If we were to have a crash and involve this many folks who perish, you could bet there's going to be a very thorough investigation. If it was a cargo aircraft with 3 or 4 crew members on board, the metric doesn't add up. It wouldn't result in a deeper investigation. It might just be, well, that's the operation that they fly cargo. We know the risks, we know they're there. Let's just move on, we found the error. Sometimes, most of the time, it's pilot error. But the risks are there, they're different. Imagine if UPS 1354 had flown the localizer into San Diego and had done the same procedures that they were using going into Birmingham that evening. And those who have flown that approach know that it's a very populated area down that hill towards the airfield. And I don't like to crutch on emotional tugs or pulls, but when you think about that, if that aircraft had hit that hill and slid down that hill, could you imagine the discussions we'd be having right now? It's very deep. And we believe we must expand our thinking. In today's aviation environment, individual corporations, as large and impactful as they are, represent a critical capability not only to an industry, but to an economy also. The risk of catastrophic failure could put an entire industry at risk. Therefore, a company's safety culture and safety performance could very well become a competitive advantage. Sometimes operations are unique amongst the cargo operators themselves. We even have operators that fly both passengers and all cargo operations. How do I know? Prior to my Delta career, I was a 727 captain flying for a non-scheduled cargo carrier. And when you fly for a non-scheduled cargo carrier, not as established as, say, a FedEx, you have a different level of safety once again. It's called 121 supplemental. And in that operation, and some of our members operate under this exemption, you don't even have a dispatcher. You have a flight follower that monitors the flight. So everything rests on the back of the pilot in command. And I would remember we would do contract carriage for carriers and freight forwarders, and the hazmat list would be from here to that back wall. And when the least of your worries is blasting caps, you know you're carrying a lot of stuff. So today, in my cockpit, when I get 5 kilograms of hairspray, you should see the drill that goes on inside the cockpit. Sign this, look at this, read that. That's a different level of safety. And it's different, but that's the nature of the business. The nature of the cargo carrier is to move hazardous material and move freight to their destinations, to the world on time. And that is important, but it also has to be done safely. Despite having unique characteristics, a regulatory backstop may be the best course of action within the industry. We believe that there should be a science-based work-rest rule for pilots in cargo operations. It should take into account their unique operational environment and yet still share some of the common boundaries that the Passenger Rule 117 has implemented. While you can't just regulate safety. That's never a tool, but you can definitely work amongst your stakeholders to mitigate risks and enhance safety. FedEx has an MD-11 landing performance team. They shared their findings and solutions with other operators of MD-11 aircraft. And great for FedEx for doing that and for coining the phrase, safety knowledge is not proprietary. And I know that's prevalent amongst a lot of the carriers in this room. Also, due to industry activity, not regulatory activity, industry activity, there's been work to contain fires inside the cargo bins of freight aircraft, which could also be carried over in technology to passenger airplanes. FedEx fire suppression systems on MD-11s is one example, also on the 777. And on the container level, UPS is working on cargo containers and extinguishing fires and containing fires inside one individual container. They're working with other industry folks and the FAA in a partnership to try to lower the risk increase the safety, and that's the type of collaboration we need. As part of the solution set, ALPA believes, and many operators agree, that risk assessments must include frontline employees and must objectively characterize the risks and offer appropriate mitigation strategies or actions. To exclude the frontline employee puts the risk methodology at risk. That's the cue to laugh a little bit. I know I've been very down low. Because the inputs could be skewed with frontline employees, you also have to bring in independent operators, consultants, people that have no dog in the game, and make sure that they're there to independently review and work on managing those risks. ALPA stood for one level of safety and security across all commercial aviation in the United States and Canada. This phrase was first used to describe the disparity in risks, protections, and safety performance between mainline and regional passenger carriers. With some of the safety gap narrowed there, we've also learned about the safety and security gap between cargo and passenger operations, as I've discussed. Thus, it's also used to describe the safety and security disparities and the differences there. A fair and level playing field is all cargo pilots want. They want the same level of regulation, the same level of safety, and the same ability to move from point A to point B and make sure that they get home to see their families. We stand at the ready to endorse this endeavor, and working with all of the volunteers and with our industry collaborative partners, we think we can get there. Let's look forward. Thank you.